Yeah.
Well, wow. Good afternoon, full house. Thanks to all of you. Pleasure, great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to each of you at this important gathering in the framework of the Geneva Peace Week, where we unite under the compelling theme, a feminist peace built by all, pathways to inclusive visions of peace. As we come together in this historic city, we have a unique opportunity to influence the discourse surrounding peace and security in meaningful ways. New York is the main hub for setting the global agenda on women, peace, and security. But here in Geneva, where we are privileged to host human rights mechanisms and humanitarian actors who are dedicated to translating the principles of the WPS agenda into actionable strategies. We are delighted that IPI has initiated this important conversation here ahead of the open debate and the 24th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 next week. And I hope that this is one of many more to strengthen exchanges between our multilateral hubs. The question of what is feminist peace and how can we build more inclusive pathways to creating it has never been more pressing. The alarming resurgence of interstate conflict, coupled with a regression in women's rights, this is no coincidence. To respond adequately and to prevent further escalation or seeds of violence, a feminist approach calls for us to address the root causes of violence, discrimination and inequalities through human rights and international law. As we see increasing violations of both human rights and international law, this has to be the fundamental starting point for peace. Feminist peace then calls on us to go further, to look at the systems which perpetuate imbalances and abuses of power, including through economic relations, which are, of course, political. It may seem radical, but I would argue that this holistic view is exactly what is needed to better manage the interdependencies within our multilateral system and achieve the kinds of transformations that we require. In Geneva, we are host to key organizations such as UNCTAD, ITC, WIPO, ITU, ILO, and I hope they too will see their role in these conversations as they progress. This gathering today is not merely a meeting of minds. It is a call to action for all of us. We must strengthen our commitments, bridge the gaps between policy and practice, and in doing so, bridge the gaps between multilateral hubs, between the hubs and the nations and the communities they serve, and between the diverse actors within them. This was the thinking behind a new initiative that we launched here in Geneva as part of the International Gender Champions in February this year. An impact group focusing on women, peace, and security, launched by Madeleine Rees, who is speaking here today, Ambassador Claudia Fuentes Julio, permanent representative of Chile to the UN here, and myself. We are bringing together key stakeholders in more regular dialogue and enhancing cooperation among member states and civil society. Specifically, the group's focus this year is on creating more coherence between the WPS agenda and human rights mechanisms to strengthen conflict prevention and response. I very much look forward to hearing more visions and initiatives from our distinguished panel. I look particularly forward to Victoria Sandino Simanca Herrera, who led negotiations during the peace process in Colombia on behalf of the FARC-EP and identifies as a feminist leader. I would like to conclude by thanking you for joining us this afternoon and thanking our co-organizers. This is the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. It's the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and the Berghoff Foundation for their collaboration in organizing today's event alongside the GCSP. And in particular, I would like to thank the International Peace Institute, who has taken the lead. And it's my great pleasure now, and it's an honor to hand the floor to my friend, Prince Said, who is currently President CEO of IPI, and is definitely no stranger to conversations about human rights and peace, having been High Commissioner for Human Rights for 4 years in this town. Said, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Greminger, for your remarks and for the strong partnership between IPI and the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And thank you also, and I'll add my voice to our partners, the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, International Gender Champions, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and the Berghoff Foundation. At IPI, we remain confident that global peace is possible, notwithstanding some of the trends which are truly terrifying, and we all know of them. But we believe that global peace is still possible. And we are trying to build that peace through a focus on strengthening inclusive multilateralism for a more peaceful and sustainable planet. We're based in New York, but we believe that building connections to communities in Geneva is key to this goal. Our vision for peace aligns with the feminist peace we are discussing today, which is a peace that is not just about the absence of violent conflict, but is about ensuring human rights for individuals of all genders. A feminist peace meaningfully includes marginalized voices in peace processes and focuses on leveraging peaceful masculinities. We look forward toward the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. It is more important than ever to examine how this agenda can move the multilateral system towards an inclusive feminist peace. So I'm confident that the panel we have today will help us think through how we can all work towards this endeavor. We have speakers who are leading in activism and research related to women's rights, women, peace and security, the gender dynamics of small arms control, and someone with first-hand experience in working to build peace in Colombia. I will now turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Phoebe Donnelly, who leads IPI's WPS program and will moderate today's discussion. Phoebe, over to you.
Thank you, Zaid. Thank you, Ambassador Greminger. Thank you all for coming in this full, cozy room. Thank you also to our partners again, Geneva Center for Security Policy, especially Carla and Flor, who really helped put together today's event, the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, the International Gender Champions, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and the Berghoff Foundation. So it truly was a feminist collaborative effort. As Zaid said, my name is Phoebe Donnelly, and I lead the Women, Peace and Security program at the International Peace Institute in New York. And we're really happy to be hosting this event at Geneva Peace Week. We have 1 hour for this fantastic panel, so I won't say more, and I will just give short introductions for each speaker. I'll introduce each panelist and pose them an opening question. Unfortunately, that means we don't have time for Q&A, but I can speak for all of us. We'd be happy to speak to you after. I also want to give a special thank you to Claudia Cruz Almeida from the Berghoff Foundation, who will be providing interpretation for Victoria Sandino during her remarks. All right, so let's get started. I think Madeline's first in the hot seat. Madeline Reese needs no introduction, but she's the former Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and co-chair of the WPS Impact Group in Geneva. Madeline, you've been working towards a feminist vision of peace for many years and recently stepped down from your role as the Secretary General of WILP. Can you tell us what you think are the main impediments to leveraging the WPS agenda in a meaningful way to support peace? Do you see a path to overcome these barriers?
Can't possibly, I'm retired now, but no. Thank you everyone for coming and for inviting us. And just as they don't know this, but we cobbled together something before to make this perhaps a little bit more interesting and different from what we would normally do. And that is, I don't know whether you've listened to the Guilty Feminist podcast. Well, a lot of us have many guilty feminist secrets that we are keeping very dark. And I am actually going to do that lawyer thing in reverse. I'm going to ask to plea and mitigation before I confess. And that is, I'm going to go to physics, and there's WILF people here who go, oh, not again. The whole, one of the things I have been doing since retirement and even before was to try to understand better why it is we do the things we do. Why is it we keep on fighting wars and doing obvious exercises in extremities of violence, which gain us nothing? And one thing that struck me enormously about a particular physics book I was reading, which has been endorsed by many others since I ventured into it, is that according to our current understanding or currently accepted laws of natural sciences, the present is determined by the past, except that when there is a quantum event we are unable to influence. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure there are some people in the room who understand what that meant. When it comes to quantum events and quantum mechanics, we'll leave that to CERN. But what it really means is the very famous evolutionary biologist Lady Gaga said, I was born this way. So hence, guilty feminism, that's inherent. If you are a feminist, you are going to feel guilty because we have not done it all. And I am a feminist, and present WILF people in the room, you weren't party to these discussions, but there has always been an ongoing undercurrent, especially when there's wine involved, of we need to have an armed wing of WILF. Women's International League for Peace. Yeah. Having said that, now I've got older, it's more or less let's have geriatric grannies, killer grannies amongst those who are retired. But it's always in a response to an emotional response, that is, to the extremities of violence that we have witnessed, that we read about, that we see all around us, particularly by men. And it is emotive. It's like, how do we stop this? How do we stop this? And then we lose our rationality for a bit. And then I start going off on my tangents about misogyny and everything else. And I'm very lucky to have people like Callum around who can talk me back into some semblance of using my prefrontal cortex, which rationalizes how our emotional thought and can help us bring us back to where we should be. So what we've got is physics explaining that that is a continuum. Physics also explaining, in fact, that there is a combination of our structures. Our structures and our brains work interconnectedly, and we're never quite sure which comes first. So feminist guilt 2, also not out to WILF people, bored with this one, Game of Thrones. I bet nearly all of you watched it. Guilt. Tribalism in extremis, hierarchies, extremities of violence, and extraordinarily gendered. But if you noted, it was the structures of power in whichever particular gang you were in, and how the female characters, once they got slotted into the positions of power, behaved exactly as the way the men did. So in fact, there was no difference. Guilt number 3, guess which one of the characters I over-identified with. You don't have to answer. Now, feminist peace could overcome all of those things I've just said if we are able to step back, look at the big picture, and think what we need to do. First of all, we need to recognize that emotionalism gives us a predisposition to fear other people. And feminism crosses borders. So we stop fearing other people and start bonding with other people. We can actually subvert the flags and the symbols that actually exhort us to violence, exhort us to militarism. So if we can think of ways and pathways we can do that, we can have a capacity to actually affect intersectionality, which is what will get us to an understanding of peace. Now, it has been shown to do that. People who are exposed to multiplicity of different cultures and beings are more likely, or far less likely, to see them as others and therefore to be feared. Now, women, peace and security agenda, how can we use that? We were a little bit cross at Wilf because we tried to get the control of weapons and the abolition of the arms trade into all of that. But of course, nope, that was way too much for a Security Council resolution. And as a result, we feel that 1325 needs to be revived in terms of its original, the aims we really had for it, which was really to try and not make war safe for women, but to actually use prevention as a means of prevention, including women, in prevention strategies to stop war. Instead, it's been captured, we've gone into a securitized modality. Let's have more women in the military, that would mean, we've got equality, all that sort of stuff. So instead of changing that structure, we're going to get sucked into it, back to Game of Thrones. Not a good idea, no. We don't want that. It's also extraordinarily hierarchical, it's militarized. And in fact, we then go off and we look at the moral complexity of conflict-related sexual violence instead of seeing it what it is, which is a continuum of the violence against women, and not something which is so outrageous we've got to have a special Security Council resolution, because you won't stop it on its own. You won't. You have to deal with a whole continuum of violence. Now, I have no guilt whatsoever in having been part of promoting what we can do as pathways to making the difference. The first one is law, and that's been based here and elsewhere. And I think if you're only going to look at the progress we've made through the brilliant women who testified at the ICTY, ICTR, what rape is in conflict, but then pushing for those changes so we understood it better through the Istanbul Convention, and the women's ratified the Istanbul Convention, become a party to it. And then we can see then the evolution then from the laws of war moving into the laws of persecution, which we say are absolutely rooted in fundamental violations of human rights, and how we're moving now and pushing into this actually is gender apartheid. So we can see law has a continuous stream which will help direct us towards better understanding, deconstructing structures, and seeing how better we can move towards justice. We understand better too political economy and how we understand and unpack the way that power works in communities, in households, in communities, within national structures and international structures, and what we must do using economy as a tool, finance as a tool, to overcome that if we did it well. We also understand better how gender works in the creation of violent masculinities and how our structural relations help to facilitate exactly the actual progression of patriarchy through that. And weapons, but I won't talk much about weapons because Callum's going to talk about weapons, but obviously, self-evidently, weapons are a fundamental, absolute fundamental obstacle to the realization of any sort of peace, feminist or otherwise. We will never have it while we have the proliferation in the way we have now, and whilst we think of it as being the panacea. Well, in 1915, we're saying militarism is a way of thought, and militarism is always weaponized. And once you've done that, you're off on a trajectory, not a path that's going to bring us towards peace. So we need to understand our structures. That includes the United Nations, which is also incredibly hierarchical, incredibly influenced by a political economy of who's got what and where, and therefore who has the influence. We can only have to, well, we will not go into the ongoing conflicts right now, but it's very obvious who is pulling the strings to all of them, and it's not us. And I think as I've got older, I have noticed how we're so polite. In all the institutions that we work in, we're so polite. But we must not be supplicants. We must not actually bow down to the hierarchies and to actually say, because you've got that position, that means you are entitled to have that opinion, make that decision, and everything else. If it's wrong, and we have to call it. Peace is ours to enjoy. And I think that's so fundamental in everything we think of. If we go back to what I was saying at the beginning, if we believe that peace is a fundamental integrated part of our possibilities, then we can find ways of achieving it. So it really has to be law, human rights, human security, not militarized security, and focus on feminist peace. And who knows, by the time you retire, maybe we'll have done it. Thank you.
So we've got physics, Lady Gaga, and Game of Thrones in one intervention, but taking us through to peace is ours to enjoy, and this idea of feminism, crossing borders, and these tools we're non-violently arming ourselves with, law, political economy, looking at violent masculinities and weapons, which we'll hear more about. So to turn to Ingrid, who I think will pick up on some of those threads. Ingrid Munch is a mediation support officer on gender responsive and inclusive peacemaking and co-lead of the gender and inclusion team for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Ingrid, what does it mean to have a truly inclusive peace that considers all genders? In particular, how should we consider the role of men and ideas around masculinities and working towards a feminist vision of peace?
Thanks a lot, Phoebe, and I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to share an answer that felt meaningful to this question, considering the devastating global context that we're in. So I hope you'll allow me to share some actually written words. So early in my role at HD as the co-lead for gender and inclusion, one of the first questions I was asked was, how sharp are your elbows? And it took me a few years to really understand what that question meant. And now I really understand it. And what it does is it encapsulates the daily struggle of trying to promote a feminist agenda, within the constraints of realpolitik in order to try and achieve feminist peace. So HD, where I'm working, is a private diplomacy organization that works to prevent, mitigate, and resolve armed conflicts through mediation and dialogue. The niche of mediation organizations like ours is to speak to actors that others don't, be it cartels, terrorist groups, gangs, sanctioned individuals, and governments. And we do this because we believe in negotiated solutions and in their power. And for these solutions to be effective, the people that are responsible for the violence have to take ownership of them. But here's the catch. Private organizations and private diplomacy organizations don't actually have any power. We can't threaten these actors, and we can't offer economic incentives. We exist within the bounds of the trusts and the consents of powerful armed and political figures. So this can lead us to have a cautious approach, a status quo bias. We try to stop the fighting, but we may shy away from addressing the root causes of conflicts, exclusion, marginalization, inequality, if the parties themselves don't want to do so. So in that way, we work towards negative peace, the absence of open armed conflicts. And that's understandable. It's often the best that we can do, or at least it's the best that we think we can do. So contrast this with what we can call positive or feminist or inclusive peace, a situation where there is no violent conflict and there is social justice and equality, where all members of society, regardless of their gender and their age and their ability and their ethnicity and their religion, experience political rights and participation, freedom from fear, safety in the public space, but also in the private space, fair access to justice, resources, services, and also transparent and accountable governance. If that sounds a bit aspirational, it's because it is. Even in countries that we consider peaceful, transforming the attitudes and institutions and structures that perpetuate injustice and violence and exclusion is really a work in progress at best. The reality of peacemaking itself often falls short of that ideal. But in the context of increasing conflict and brutality, at least for me, feminist peace is a vision or a North Star or a set of principles that I can carry with me in my day-to-day work. And it drives me to keep asking, who are we creating peace for, and who are we excluding from the peace that we're building? So achieving feminist peace, to answer your question, isn't just about women or for women or by women. It's about transforming gender roles and power relations for everyone. And so I want to share a few ways in which we can consider men and masculinities in this endeavor. The first one is to recognize diverse masculinities. Just as all women don't share the same life experience of vulnerability and oppression, all men don't share a lived experience of power and privilege. For every elite man who benefits from conflicts, there are thousands that are sent to fights, imprisoned, violated, dispossessed, traumatized, caught between societal expectations to protect and provide and the sheer impossibility of doing that in the face of vast injustices. If some men gain from militarized patriarchy, most are deeply harmed by it. And so that leads to my second advice, building alliances. Working towards feminist peace means building robust cross-societal alliances, including with the men that are being harmed by the current paradigm. If we can identify the grievances and the needs and the vulnerabilities of diverse and non-elite men, then we can extend an invitation. Join us on the issues that you face in conflicts, And that can be expropriation, it can be forced recruitment, it can be sexual violence, it can be arbitrary detention, and so on. Those issues will be ours too. The third is engaging men in power. And this is thornier because it involves working with those that benefit from the current status quo. It doesn't feel good, but it's actually indispensable. So there's 3 strategies that I can think of to share. The first one is framing feminist demands in terms that are going to be culturally resonant. And one example of that is in the Bangsamoro negotiations in the Philippines. The term non-discrimination based on sex became parity of esteem. And this, in this Muslim context, avoided the contentious word sex, but carried the same meaning and the same impacts. The second strategy is identifying and collaborating with men and male allies in positions of influence that are not considered as gender experts or feminist allies. And that's something that WILF does very well and has done, for example, in Afghanistan, where they worked to mobilize male religious scholars to spread interpretations of Sharia law that were consistent with, for example, having women negotiating with Taliban. The third one is creating exposure opportunities. So in Colombia, we've seen how exposing negotiators to victims' testimonies was a watershed moment. But I've just seen myself from personal experience, the power that just taking a male colleague along with me to spend 3 days with women's groups from a conflict-affected context, how powerful that can be in creating paradigm shifts. So all of this takes a lot of time, it takes trust, and it takes countless conversations. It's not easy, and it often feels like pushing a really hard, really heavy rock up a really steep hill. And a question that lives in my head constantly is, why should I spend so much time pandering to the bad guys or to the well-meaning but clueless ones when there's so many incredible grassroots feminist organizations that I could be working for and supporting? Well, to be a feminist in peacemaking is to accept discomforts. When I'm raising issues of inclusion, I'm often told, this isn't how the field works, you're gonna learn. And so it's very easy to feel like an imposter, to question if you're naive on the one hand, or if you've sold out on the other. But I've come to see this discomfort as the sign that I'm doing something right, disrupting the status quo and asking uncomfortable questions, while also trying to keep myself accountable. So this is my guilty feminist moments. Being a feminist in the peacemaking sector means trying to dismantle the master's house while sitting comfortably within it, getting paid to do that, and mostly with the master's tool at your disposal. So it's really uncomfortable and raises daily dilemmas about integrity, about compromise, and doing what's effective versus what is right or what feels good. So the reality, of course, is much more complex than a binary choice between pragmatic, cynical, realpolitik and naive radical idealism. Inclusive peace is not an either or, it's a spectrum. And so working towards inclusive peace within the constraints of reality means trying to etch a middle path, slowly redefining what power means into more diverse forms of influence, recognizing that every small step that we're taking lays the groundwork for more significant changes, and celebrating even the smallest mindset shifts amongst our critics as victories. So in conclusion, when working towards feminist peace, what we're doing is really tackling entire systems of conflict and militarization and patriarchy. And we have very little control over the outcome. So all we have control over is the process, and that's the efforts that we put in. For all intents and purposes, here the means are the ends, because we're trying to show a different paradigm, a different way in which people can relate to one another, can collaborate, can resolve problems, and can empower each other. So feminist peace can feel overwhelmingly distant when we consider the structures that are underpinning present-day conflicts. So what we have to do, and I do this every day, is remind myself that feminist peace is also a process. So every action that we're taking that's driven by feminist principles, whether that's showing up with care and compassion, whether it's trying to reach out to skeptics through empathy, whether it's using privilege to try and amplify marginalized voices. So all of that is part of this process. So being a feminist in peacemaking is a daily practice of pushing for more inclusive processes and outcomes, even when that feels impossible. But it's in this very practice that we begin to embody the peace that we seek to create in this world. And so in this way, every single day, every single one of us in all of our different roles, all of our different responsibilities, and also in our daily life, each of us is actually getting a chance to take responsibility and to make a difference.
much, Ingrid. That was so powerful. And thank you for bringing us into your experiences. This idea of feminist peace as this vision, this North Star, this process. And also, if you're uncomfortable today here, you're doing good. So congratulations. I'll turn to Callum. Callum is the gender coordinator for the Small Arms Survey. Callum, you've produced a report recently on small arms control and the WPS agenda, and I think there are some of those reports floating around. So tell us, what does meaningful participation and collaboration between the WPS agenda and small arms control look like in practice? And why is linking WPS with other policy agendas important to building a feminist peace?
Thanks a lot, Phoebe. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. But yeah, I'm feeling like the imposter following the two speeches by Ingrid and Madeline. I really like this idea of framing what we're talking about as being kind of guilty feminists. So take from the podcast, I'm a feminist, but when Madeline's organization, WILP, invited me to a meeting in London on addressing men's violence involvement in armed conflict, I did check to see if lunch was included.
And there's worse, but he's not admitted to it.
Okay, I'll admit to the one that I think is more challenging being a man working in this particular area is that the way that we are as a Small Arms Survey, I am paid more than any women in the Small Arms Survey, right? So that's the kind of baggage that I carry with me in the work that I try and do. So before I answer the question, I think I have to reflect on some of the things that Ingrid has said, and I'd wholeheartedly agree that what we're looking at when it comes to feminist peace is we're looking at positive peace. We're looking at ensuring justice, equality, and freedom from all kinds of violence. And if I begin to apply that to the small arms field, I think we produce, for example, a global violent deaths database. The latest figures from 2021 show that 84% of victims of violent deaths are men, and 91% of victims of armed violence are men. But there's a trick here, right? Because we've talked before about what positive peace really means. These figures don't look at the fact that arms are used to facilitate sexual and domestic violence. And they have wider impacts. When you have armed conflict, that restricts the ability of diverse groups of women and men to access their right to education, their right to economic opportunities, their right to political participation. And the proliferation of these arms is also what causes discrimination against diverse groups in society. So the trap when you come to small arms is you just look at deaths. And when you do that, then you don't really have a full idea of how small arms contribute to conflict. So what can we gain from applying a feminist perspective to the small arms field? I think, as Madeline's begun to touch on, one of the things that we bring when we look at feminist approaches is we're curious about gender roles, gendered behaviors, gender relations, and we're curious about how all of those things relate to conflict. I think it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that conflict actually is a mentality, right? Conflict, of course, there's physical effects of conflict, but whether we decide something is a conflict or not is in our collective consciousness. It's a term that we decide to apply as a society. And the danger of this is that when we decide we're in conflict, we decide as a society that we're going to have different gender roles. We're going to tolerate different gender norms. We're going to glorify different ways of behaving as women and men. We're going to perhaps accept that it's good to be violent in certain circumstances. So there's a fundamental shift in what we accept in terms of the roles and norms and behaviors in society. But that shift doesn't always go back afterwards. And so I think it's very important that when we're looking to achieve positive peace, we also need to consider what's sometimes called in my field psychological disarmament. So have we created that shift back? Were those people that we encouraged to go into conflict, to take up arms, have we encouraged that shift back? Because those very same gender norms and gender roles that we perpetuated are often linked to gender-based violence and discrimination. So that's the question. And I'd also draw attention to some work done by one of my colleagues, Darine Atwa, called Feeling the Heat, exploring the link between emotions and violence. And she shows how anger, humiliation, frustration influence perceptions, beliefs, and reasoning that ultimately leads people to join armed groups. So we really need to look at this psychological component if we're going to achieve positive peace. Now, Madeline has probably already demonstrated this is not really something new in the feminist movement, right? But the trick is that to have an impact, we need to take these ideas out of the WPS agenda and out of the gender equality sphere and start applying them to other areas such as small arms control. And I will say, just like Ingrid, I very much felt like an imposter coming into the small arms control field. You'll see some of my co-conspirators there at the back, Renata Delacqua and Hannah Salama, probably have gone through kind of similar feelings when it comes to working in small arms, because there's a perception that you have to know about the weapon itself to be an expert in small arms control. And I realize that's a bit of a trap, because that will only lead to negative peace. We can't just control the proliferation of weapons and not talk about the impact of armed violence. And I wondered about why this was. Well, this is because when you have international treaties and agreements on the arms trade, states are much more interested in approaches that will remove weapons that have been stolen from the national stockpile by terrorists than actually understanding why those same terrorists wanted to steal the weapons in the first place, right? So it's actually important that we have people who feel like imposters working in the small arms field. So if we want to achieve feminist peace in this field, we need to shift who talks and what we're talking about. And I'll provide some ideas of what this means in terms of meaningful participation in small arms control. And the first thing we try and do is we work on collaborative research. So we work on small arms control projects, measuring impacts, collecting data with different feminist organizations. And what this does is it can, first of all, bring diverse groups around a common issue. Sometimes you realize actually that small arms control is a feminist issue, and the fact that it's not being talked about at all is a problem. But it also helps those individuals feel that they have more competence, confidence, and authority when it comes to policy processes. Similarly, we've worked on preparatory workshops before processes such as national action plans on small arms and light weapons. You bring women's organizations into the room and they say, oh, we don't know anything about guns. And you're like, I'm pretty sure you know quite a lot about armed violence. So once you've begun to have that conversation, once you've begun to demystify the different terminology, then you end up with a pathway to meaningful participation in those processes. And they don't always agree. So right now in Ukraine, we've got challenges. It's not really a challenge, but we've got some feminist organizations who say we need to stop the proliferation of weapons in civilian areas because we need to prevent domestic violence. On the other hand, you've got those who say female veterans have an equal right to access weapons for their own safety. And so we're in a position where we recognize that a small arms control process is a democratic one, where everybody can bring in their different perceptions. In addition, I'd say it's also important to shift the agenda away from looking at just the supply of weapons. So where weapons come from, how they get into different countries, where they're diverted from, but also to understand the demands for firearms. So what is it about those gendered roles and perceptions and behaviors that means that particularly men, and in Ukraine, we found that 50% of civilian men now want a weapon. Where is that demand coming from? And actually, a colleague of mine and I, Aline Shaban, wrote another publication with CIPRI called What Happened to Demand? Getting Small Arms Control Back on Track. And this was a topic that was brought up by the Quakers at the very beginning of all of the arms control instruments, but has been largely lost. But in the fourth review conference of the Programme of Action, there was a reference to recognize that eradicating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, including by addressing gender roles, norms, and expectations for women and men to acquire illicit arms, contributes to preventing and combating gender-based violence and sexual violence, as well as conflict-related sexual violence. And I think when you begin to look at demand, you avoid some of these obscure entry points that sometimes you find yourself working in. So there's a tendency to say, well, women need to have a role in arms production. And you're like, wait, how did we get there? It's kind of a weird direction. Or another one I see more commonly is men get to make the policies, and you say, oh, well, we need to include women. And they're like, oh yeah, we need to have a sensitization campaign. So paid men get to make policies, and then unpaid women get to promote it, including civilian disarmament programs that carries quite a lot of risk to them. So to close, what I'll say is we need to be talking about emotions and psychology. We need to get WPS into other agendas. But really, I think feminist peace happens where imposters meet.
all uncomfortable imposters. But thank you so much. This term psychological disarmament, I think is really sitting to me. I'm now going to turn with Victoria Sandino Simanca Herrera. She is, as I mentioned, Claudia from the Berghoff Foundation will be providing interpretation. But Victoria is a feminist leader, former senator of the Republic of Colombia, was a negotiator during the peace process in Colombia, and is an ex-combatant of the FARC-EP. And so, Victoria, based on your experience during the peace process in Colombia, what strategies are most effective in ensuring feminist perspectives are considered during peace processes? How do we ensure these provisions are then sustainably implemented? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bueno, español, y aquí está mi salvadora. Entonces, decirle que me gustaría antes invitarles a que piensen e imaginen al tiempo qué puede producir el feminismo en la vida de las mujeres populares al conocer de su existencia y ser activistas de sus postulados.
First, Victoria would like to invite all to imagine and to think what effect can feminism have in the women, the local women of Colombia, when they first hear about feminism.
Esto siempre y cuando entendamos el feminismo como una corriente de pensamiento y acción que busca eliminar todas las prácticas que tienen como objetivo, propósito, mantener el orden social patriarcal en el que las mujeres son excluidas, discriminadas y subordinadas, en contra de todas las violencias, más en contextos de conflictos armados, como el caso de Colombia.
Of course, inviting you to think about feminism, but I am referring to the feminism as the current thought and action that seeks to eliminate all practices that aim to maintain the patriarchal social order in which women are excluded, discriminated, and subordinated. And it seeks to eliminate all forms of violence, especially in context of armed conflict.
Hablo de ese feminismo que está en contra de todo tipo de opresión, no solamente contra la opresión hacia las mujeres, sino ese que busca grandes transformaciones a favor de la humanidad y de la vida misma. Decirles entonces que desde mi experiencia, ese fue el feminismo que descubrimos en medio del proceso de negociaciones de La Habana entre la insurgencia de las FARC, de la cual hice parte, y el gobierno de Colombia. Lo analizamos en nuestra vida como insurgentes, con las mujeres de los territorios que se autodenominan mujeres populares, y también lo pusimos en diálogo con todas aquellas amigas que venían con ideas y luchas feministas hacía ya muchos años en mi país. Lo interiorizamos y lo pusimos en acción para la construcción de la paz.
I'm talking about that feminism that is against all kind of oppression, not only against the oppression of women, but also that seeks for the transformation in favor of humanity and life itself. That's the feminism Victoria discovered in Havana when she was in the negotiation process between the FARC-EP, that she belonged to, and the government of Colombia. They took that feminism, they analyzed it, and applied to their lives as insurgents. With the women of the local territories, they also discussed about it. They put it into context and dialogue with those friends of Colombia who had been working on feminism for many years. And they share ideas and struggles. And then they internalized that feminism and they put it into action for peace building.
¿Y cuál fue la estrategia? Pues tener la convicción y luchar por ello, de que el acuerdo de paz de 2016 tenía que plasmar las agendas los intereses de las mujeres en toda su diversidad. Y de las mujeres, ¿de cuáles mujeres estamos hablando? De las mujeres campesinas, indígenas, negras, de las mujeres de las comunas y barrios de las ciudades de Colombia, de las mujeres, de la academia, de la cultura, de las trabajadoras, de las mujeres diversas, sexual e identitaria, y por supuesto de las mujeres insurgentes y rebeldes que éramos nosotras ahí.
So what's the strategy? What was the strategy? How did it work for us? We had the conviction and we fought for it. For us, it had to be that the 2016 peace agreement had to reflect the agendas and interests of women in all their diversity. Rural women, farmer women, indigenous women, Black women, women in the communities and neighborhoods of Colombian cities, women in the academia, the culture, women workers, and women of diverse identity. Also, the women insurgent and the rebel women.
Había que dialogar con todo el mundo, ponerles en la mesa de conversaciones. Tuvimos que diseñar y desarrollar y, bueno, desplegar la más potente y versátil diplomacia feminista para la paz en todos los niveles, para que todas las personas y entes que tuvieran que ver con el proceso de negociaciones entendieran que no solo había que hablar de la paz como el fin del conflicto armado, sino que esa paz debía analizar las afectaciones de las mujeres en ese conflicto e incluir medidas afirmativas que repararan de alguna manera dichas afectaciones, pero sobre todo que transformaran la vida de las mujeres.
We believed that we had to discuss and dialogue with everyone. We had to put the topic on the agenda, but also we had to design, develop, and deploy the most powerful and versatile feminist diplomacy for peace at all levels, so that all people and entities involved in the peace negotiation process would understand that it was not only necessary to talk about peace as the end of the armed conflict, but that peace had to be analyzed based on the effects it had on women and include actually measures that will somehow repair those effects of the conflict, but above all, that would also transform the lives of the women.
Buscamos de convencer a los colegas de la mesa, de la parte de la insurgencia, que eran hombres curtidos en la guerra de muchos años, incluso décadas, machistas, por supuesto, que no entendían nada ni conocían nada del feminismo. También a la contraparte en la mesa, que eran los representantes del gobierno, a la comunidad internacional, para que nos apoyaran y blindaran el trabajo que estábamos haciendo, porque de lo contrario no iba a funcionar. Y también a las mujeres de los gobiernos que estaban en las respectivas delegaciones, porque eso tenía que establecer una alianza entre nosotras, ¿no? También con las mujeres de los territorios de Colombia, del movimiento de mujeres, con las diversidades de mujeres a nivel internacional, todas aquellas que luchan por la paz, por las causas de las mujeres, como libre pensadoras, de ONGs, de ONU Mujeres, de la representante, por ejemplo, que nos apoyó mucho, la representante especial del secretario general de Naciones Unidas sobre violencia sexual en los conflictos. Esta diplomacia feminista desplegó grandes alianzas que hizo imposible que las partes determinantes en la mesa de conversaciones se negaran a incluir el enfoque de género que habíamos trabajado durante 3 años de los 4 que duró el proceso de paz.
So our strategy, we had to talk. We had to talk and try to convince everyone. We started with our colleagues at the table, who were insurgents, had been part of the insurgency, were men, and also patriarchal, based on the patriarchal norms, and had gone through tough war, and who obviously did not know anything about feminism. But we also had to equally talk with our counterparts at the government. We also talked to the international community. We needed them to support us and also to protect the safe and to have a safe space to discuss issues related to feminism. But above all, what we needed was a great alliances among the women, among the women from the insurgency and the women from the government, also those at the local territory, also international women that had been working for peace during many years, NGOs, international NGOs, the United Nations, UN Women, and also we had a lot of support from the special representatives of the Secretary General of the United Nations on Sexual Violence in Conflict. This was basically the effort of a feminist diplomacy deployed great alliances which were made possible that the gender component was then incorporated into the final peace agreement.
Bueno, ¿y cómo garantizar que estas disposiciones se apliquen de forma sostenible? Eso es magia. Habrá que hacer magia. Aquí simplemente quiero hacer unas recomendaciones porque dar lecciones pues de un proceso a otro no hay muchas diferencias, ¿no? Sobre todo en los contextos actuales. Una de estas puede ser, es necesario, es fundamental la voluntad política de las partes implicadas en la mesa de conversaciones y en particular de los gobiernos comprometidos con la paz y con el cumplimiento de los acuerdos que se establezcan.
So on the question on how can we ensure that these provisions are actually sustainable, Victoria said that we cannot do magic and we cannot take lessons from one context and apply it directly to the other. So she's going to give a couple of recommendations. The first one, and the most important one for her, is the political will of the parties involved in the peace talks, in particular of those governments that are committed to peace.
También se requiere el compromiso y apuesta de la comunidad internacional, de todos estos organismos multilaterales como la ONU, no solo en la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad. Se debe avanzar mucho más allá de las identidades y de una paz incluyente. Eso debe materializarse.
The second one is the commitment and engagement of the international community. Victoria refers to multilateral bodies such as the UN, but also not only the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and going a bit beyond and try also to think in the diverse identities that can make possible an inclusive peace.
Voy a decir algo que seguramente no es políticamente correcto. Y es que se requiere también del compromiso real de las ONGs, de distintas organizaciones que luchan por los derechos de las mujeres. Y esto lo digo porque la paz es una empresa. Y lo digo con respeto, pero con crítica también. Es que se vive mucho de la paz, se contribuye poco a la solución y sobre todo a que en el mundo podamos vivir en mejores condiciones y de acabar con los conflictos violentos que tanto nos hacen daño en países como el nuestro.
Victoria said that she wanted to say something that maybe is not politically correct, but she wanted to ask for the meaningful commitment of the international NGOs and other local NGOs and those organizations advocating for women's rights. Victoria shared that peace is sometimes a business and there is a lot said, but not so much investing actually in what the changes that need to be made.
Bueno, ya más suave. Desplegar la más audaz de las diplomacias y alianzas feministas para lograr realmente que los tratados de paz sea con el protagonismo de las mujeres, que se incorporen y garanticen los derechos de ellas en todas las diversidades, porque hablaban mis compañeros y compañeras de panel, que las mujeres somos diversas. En términos raciales o étnicos, sociales, culturales, de género, de clase. Y bueno, necesitamos que todas esas diversidades nos sintamos constructoras y protagonistas de una paz incluyente.
And as the last recommendation, Victoria is asking for the boldness of feminist diplomacy in which we can create alliances among different organizations that ensure peace, and that women in all its diversity, the different races, ethnicity, gender, class, culture, can be represented and can actually make an impact to advance on a meaningful peace.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria, for sharing your experiences and the tireless feminist diplomacy it took to pursue that process. I am so sad that we have to close this panel. I think we could all talk for a long time, but I wanted to pull out a few threads I saw coming through. This idea of alliances and crossing borders, the idea to talk to everyone, but don't be polite. The idea to have these emotions and tolerate discomfort, have this psychological disarmament. We have some tools we've talked about of laws, addressing masculinities, talking to men, political economy, thinking about weapons, talking about weapons, even if we feel like imposters. And this idea that I'll leave you with of this feminist peace or positive peace, that North Star. So we have some closing remarks from His Excellency Hirohiko Atsuyuki, the permanent representative of Japan to the United Nations office at Geneva, and he can give the remarks from the podium and then we'll close.
Good afternoon, and I'm not sure if I'm the right person to close this meeting, but it has been a very interesting meeting in many ways. And thank you for a lot of insights. I'm one of the gender champions, and I want to be, but I wasn't familiar with many of the ideas that you suggested. So it was a very insightful meeting in many ways for me. And as a party, well, talking about Japan a little bit, as a party to relevant international human rights instruments, including CEDAW. CEDAW has a meeting this week. And we consider policies focused on gender equality to be among the most important for realizing a society where all people can feel that their purpose in life, their diversity, and their individuality are respected. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and the 25th anniversary of the landmark resolution 1325. At this critical juncture, together with Norway, we will co-chair the WPS Focal Points Network in 2025 and host its capital level meeting in Tokyo in February. The Focal Points Network is an indispensable forum for sharing best practices, encourage cooperation between countries, and promoting the WPS agenda. WPS agenda, by the way, was very close to the heart of our previous foreign minister. There was a change of government, but I think she will continue to be very active in this area. So all in all, we are committed to the promotion of the WPS agenda and cooperation among members through this network. We reaffirm our commitment to accelerating the progress on gender equality, empowerment of women and girls, and the WPS agenda, and look forward to continue to work closely with all stakeholders, including civil society, in Geneva and beyond. I very much see the value of collaborating with you. Thank you very much for your wonderful ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our panel. Oh my God.